Karoline Leavitt had always been someone who liked to keep things simple. She wasn't flashy or loud, and she preferred her life that way, quiet, but meaningful. That day, as she stepped onto the plane for her first-class flight to New York, she felt a mix of excitement and nerves. This trip was important. It could be the stepping stone she needed for her career. With her laptop bag slung over one shoulder and her boarding pass in hand, she walked down the narrow aisle toward her seat, finding her spot near the window. Karoline settled in comfortably. The leather seats were plush, just like she'd imagined, and there was enough legroom to stretch out, a luxury she rarely experienced. As she placed her small carry-on bag under the seat in front of her, her fingers brushed against the delicate silver chain around her neck. It was a tiny cross, unassuming yet precious to her. Her grandmother had given it to her years ago, and it had become something of a good luck charm. Whether she was heading into an important meeting or traveling somewhere new, wearing the cross made her feel connected to her family, her values, and herself. She adjusted the necklace slightly so it rested neatly against her collarbone and then turned her attention to her work. Pulling out her laptop, she opened a document filled with notes for the presentation she'd be giving in New York. But before she could dive in, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. A flight attendant was making her way through the cabin, greeting passengers with polite smiles and offering help where needed. Her name tag read, Rachel, and while she looked professional enough, there was something distant about her demeanor. Karoline glanced up briefly as Rachel approached her row. Their eyes met for a split second, and Karoline offered a warm smile, hoping to break the ice. After all, flying first class wasn't something she did every day, and she figured a little friendliness couldn't hurt. But instead of returning the smile, Rachel's expression shifted ever so slightly. At first, Karoline thought maybe she'd imagined it. But then Rachel's gaze dropped to the cross hanging around her neck, lingering for just a moment too long. There was no mistaking the flicker of disapproval that crossed her face. It was subtle, but it was there. For a moment, Karoline felt uneasy. Why would someone care about a simple piece of jewelry? She hadn't worn anything extravagant or attention-grabbing. It was just her cross, the same one she'd worn countless times before without anyone batting an eyelid. Still, she tried not to let it bother her. Maybe Rachel was having a bad day, or perhaps she was simply distracted by the pre-flight rush. Whatever the reason, Karoline decided to brush it off and focus on her work. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Little did she know this seemingly ordinary flight was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would leave both her and Rachel questioning their assumptions and learning lessons neither of them anticipated. Rachel moved on from Karoline's seat, her polished smile returning as she greeted the next passenger. But the brief exchange, or rather lack of one, stayed with her. She couldn't quite explain why, but something about that cross had rubbed her the wrong way. Maybe it was the way it caught the light, drawing just enough attention to itself without being gaudy. Or maybe it was something deeper, something she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. Whatever it was, Rachel felt a strange mix of irritation and unease bubbling beneath her professional exterior. As she continued her rounds, handing out menus and explaining beverage options, Rachel found herself glancing back at Karoline every so often. The young woman seemed completely unfazed, typing away on her laptop with quiet focus. Her posture was relaxed, almost serene, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. That only fueled Rachel's frustration. How could someone wear something so deliberate and yet act like it didn't matter? When Rachel finally returned to Karoline's row to take drink orders, she hesitated for a moment. Professionalism demanded that she remain courteous, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. "You might want to remove that thing before we get started," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. Some people find religious symbols distracting. The cabin fell silent for a fraction of a second, the weight of her comment hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Karoline's fingers froze over her keyboard and she looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, neither woman spoke. Then Karoline replied, her voice calm but firm. "This is a personal item that means a lot to me. I don't see how it affects anyone else." Her response caught Rachel off guard. She hadn't expected pushback, not in first class where passengers usually kept their heads down and avoided confrontation. Most people would have simply nodded and complied, no questions asked. But not Karoline. There was a quiet strength in her words, a confidence that made Rachel feel even more unsettled. Without another word, Rachel forced a tight smile and moved on to the next passenger, pretending not to notice the curious glances from nearby seats. One older man raised an eyebrow at his wife, clearly overhearing the exchange. Another passenger, a middle-aged woman in a sharp blazer, shot Rachel a disapproving look before turning back to her magazine. Rachel could feel the tension spreading through the cabin like ripples in a pond, each wave carrying whispers of what had just happened. Karoline, meanwhile, sat perfectly still, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this kind of treatment. Not here, not now. First class was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where everything ran smoothly and everyone was treated with respect. Instead, she'd been singled out for something as simple as wearing a necklace. It wasn't fair, and it certainly wasn't right. But instead of letting anger take hold, Karoline took a deep breath and reminded herself to stay composed. Losing her temper wouldn't solve anything, and besides, she refused to let one unpleasant interaction ruin her trip. Still, the comment stung more than she cared to admit. Words had power, and Rachel's choice of them, calling her cross a thing, implying it was somehow inappropriate or unwelcome, felt dismissive and disrespectful. Karoline glanced down at the small silver charm resting against her chest. To anyone else it might have looked insignificant, but to her, it represented faith, family, and resilience. It was a reminder of who she was and where she came from, especially during moments when she needed grounding the most. By the time the plane began taxiing down the runway, the atmosphere in first class had shifted noticeably. Conversations were quieter, more subdued, as if everyone was waiting to see what might happen next. Karoline tried to focus on her work again, but her thoughts kept circling back to the flight attendant's words. What had driven Rachel to say something like that? Was it genuinely about the cross, or was there something else going on beneath the surface? For her part, Rachel struggled to shake off the encounter as well. As she secured trays and double-checked seatbelts, she replayed the conversation in her head. Had she gone too far? Sure, she prided herself on maintaining control in the cabin, but this felt different. This wasn't about enforcing rules or keeping things running smoothly. It was personal, and that realization gnawed at her, making her question whether she'd crossed a line she shouldn't have. Despite the tension, the flight attendants went about their duties, dimming the lights and preparing for takeoff. Outside the window, the tarmac blurred as the plane picked up speed, lifting into the sky. Inside, however, the mood remained heavy, weighed down by unspoken emotions and lingering discomfort. Neither Karoline nor Rachel knew it yet, but this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge both of them in ways they hadn't anticipated. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the hum of engines filled the cabin, blending with the occasional rustle of blankets and soft murmurs of conversation. The initial tension from Rachel's comment lingered like an invisible cloud, heavy but unspoken. Passengers in first class went about their routines. Some sipped coffee, others scrolled through emails or flipped pages of magazines. But there was an undercurrent of awareness. Everyone had heard what happened, even if they pretended otherwise. Karoline tried to focus on her laptop screen, but her mind kept drifting back to Rachel's words. They replayed in her head like a broken record. You might want to remove that thing. The word thing echoed loudest, sharp and dismissive. It wasn't just the insult itself that bothered her, it was the implication behind it. Her cross wasn't some random trinket, it was a piece of her identity, a connection to her roots and beliefs. To call it a thing felt like reducing something deeply meaningful to nothing more than an inconvenience. She glanced up briefly, catching sight of Rachel moving down the aisle. The flight attendant seemed calm enough, collecting empty cups and offering refills with practiced efficiency. But Karoline noticed the stiffness in her movements, the way she avoided eye contact with certain passengers. It was subtle, but telling. Maybe Rachel regretted what she'd said, or maybe she was simply trying to move past it without causing further disruption. Either way, Karoline couldn't help feeling a mix of frustration and pity. Here was someone whose job was all about customer service, yet she'd let her own biases, or whatever this was, get in the way. Nearby, other passengers exchanged knowing looks. An older couple seated across the aisle whispered quietly, their voices low but audible. "Did you hear that?" the man muttered to his wife. "That poor girl didn't deserve that." His wife nodded, shaking her head slightly. "It's none of the attendant's business what she wears," she added, glancing over at Karoline with sympathy. A few rows ahead, a woman in a tailored blazer leaned closer to her companion. "Honestly, I've seen worse reactions to tattoos or hats, but a necklace? That's ridiculous," she said, her tone laced with disbelief. Her friend shrugged, agreeing silently. These small moments of solidarity weren't lost on Karoline. She caught fragments of their conversations, snippets of support that reminded her she wasn't alone in finding Rachel's comment out of line. Still, she chose not to engage. Confrontation wouldn't change anything, at least not right now. For Rachel, the weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing minute. Every time she passed Karoline's seat, she felt a pang of guilt gnawing at her insides. At first, she told herself she was justified. After all, airlines had rules about decorum and professionalism, didn't they? Surely wearing something overtly religious could make others uncomfortable. But as the minutes ticked by, doubt crept in. Was that really true, or was she grasping at excuses? She couldn't recall any official policy banning jewelry based on its symbolism. And even if there were, did it apply here? Karoline's cross was modest, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Rachel's thoughts spiraled as she worked. She thought about her own upbringing, about the values drilled into her by family and society. Growing up, religion had always been a touchy subject in her household, something to be respected but kept private. Maybe that's why seeing Karoline wear her faith so openly made her uneasy. But deep down, Rachel knew discomfort wasn't an excuse for rudeness. If anything, it highlighted her own shortcomings, forcing her to confront biases she hadn't realized she carried. The turning point came when turbulence hit. About halfway through the flight, the plane jolted suddenly, sending drinks sloshing and tray tables rattling. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as passengers gripped armrests and braced themselves. Rachel stumbled slightly near Karoline's row, her balance thrown off by the sudden drop. Instinctively, Karoline reached out to steady her, grabbing her forearm to keep her from falling. For a brief moment, their eyes met again. This time, the connection was different. There was no anger in Karoline's gaze, only concern. Rachel froze, caught off guard by the gesture. In that split second, she saw something unexpected: kindness. Despite everything, Karoline hadn't held a grudge. Instead, she'd acted on instinct, offering help without hesitation. It was a small act, but it spoke volumes. "Are you okay?" Karoline asked softly, releasing Rachel's arm once she regained her footing. Rachel nodded quickly, embarrassed by the stumble and the attention it drew. "Yes, thank you," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. As she straightened up and continued securing loose items, she couldn't shake the memory of that brief interaction. Karoline's kindness stood in stark contrast to the tension. Earlier, leaving Rachel with a sinking realization, she'd misjudged the young woman entirely. By the time the turbulence subsided, the mood in the cabin began to shift. Passengers relaxed, chatting lightly about how bumpy flights always made them nervous. Karoline returned to her work, though her thoughts remained elsewhere. For Rachel, the experience marked a turning point. She found herself questioning not just her actions but also her assumptions. Had she let personal bias cloud her judgment? And if so, how could she make things right? Unbeknownst to both women, the turbulence had done more than rattle the plane. It had shaken loose some hidden truths, setting the stage for a chance at understanding and redemption. The rest of the flight felt different after the turbulence. The sharp edges of tension that had lingered in the cabin seemed to soften, like a storm passing and leaving behind a calmer sky. Passengers settled back into their routines, reading, chatting quietly or dozing off, but there was an unspoken shift in the air. For Rachel, the encounter with Karoline during the bumpy patch replayed in her mind over and over. That moment of kindness, unexpected and genuine, stuck with her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Karoline, for her part, tried to push the incident out of her thoughts. She told herself it wasn't worth dwelling on. After all, she'd been through worse situations in life. But every time Rachel passed by her seat, she couldn't help but notice the slight change in the flight attendant's demeanor. There was something softer now, less guarded. It was subtle, a fleeting glance here, a hesitant smile there, but it was enough to make Karoline wonder if maybe Rachel regretted her earlier comment. As the hours ticked by, Rachel wrestled with her own emotions. She prided herself on being professional, on keeping her personal feelings separate from her job. Yet here she was, letting her biases, or whatever they were, get in the way of doing her duty. What made it worse was knowing that Karoline hadn't retaliated or lashed out. Instead, she'd shown grace, even going so far as to steady Rachel when the turbulence hit. That act of kindness gnawed at Rachel, forcing her to confront how small and selfish she'd been. Dinner service began, and Rachel approached each passenger with renewed focus. She smiled warmly, asked polite questions about meal preferences, and thanked people for their patience. When she reached Karoline's row again, she hesitated for just a second before asking, "Would you like chicken or pasta?" Her tone was neutral, almost cautious, as though she was testing the waters. Karoline looked up from her laptop, surprised by the question. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Rachel saw something in Karoline's expression that gave her pause. Not anger, not resentment, but understanding. "Chicken, please," Karoline replied calmly, her voice steady. Rachel nodded and handed her the tray, making sure everything was neatly arranged before stepping back. But instead of moving on immediately, she lingered for a beat longer than necessary. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" she asked, her words tinged with uncertainty. Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying Rachel's face. She could see the flicker of remorse in the flight attendant's eyes, the quiet struggle playing out beneath the surface. Part of her wanted to say nothing, to let Rachel sit with the weight of her actions. But another part of her recognized that holding on to bitterness wouldn't serve anyone, not her, not Rachel, and certainly not the rest of the flight. So she shook her head gently and said, "No, thank you. Everything looks fine." Rachel nodded, offering a tight smile before continuing down the aisle. But the exchange stayed with her, lingering like the faint echo of a song. For the first time since boarding the plane, she allowed herself to truly reflect on what had happened. Why had she reacted so strongly to Karoline's cross? Was it fear of judgment from other passengers? Or was it something deeper, rooted in her own insecurities? As the meal service wrapped up, Rachel found herself standing near the galley organizing trays and silverware. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about Karoline again. The quiet confidence, the lack of hostility, despite being treated unfairly. Most people would have snapped back or demanded an apology on the spot, but Karoline hadn't. She'd chosen dignity over drama, and that choice spoke volumes. It was then that Rachel realized she needed to say something. Not because it was required or expected, but because it was the right thing to do. She didn't want this flight to end with unresolved tension hanging between them. More importantly, she didn't want to carry the guilt of her actions any longer. Taking a deep breath, Rachel decided to approach Karoline one last time before landing procedures began. This time, she walked to her seat with purpose, her steps slower and more deliberate. As she stopped beside Karoline's row, she cleared her throat softly to get her attention. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Do you have a moment?" Karoline glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly in surprise. "Of course," she replied, closing her laptop and setting it aside. Rachel hesitated, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. Apologizing wasn't easy for her. It never had been, but she knew she couldn't back down now. "I wanted to apologize and for earlier," she began, her words tumbling out quickly at first. What I said about your necklace, it wasn't appropriate. I'm sorry if I offended you. For a moment, Karoline didn't respond. She simply looked at Rachel, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. Thank you for apologizing, she said, her voice calm but firm. It did upset me, but I appreciate you acknowledging it. Rachel exhaled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. I shouldn't have said what I did, she admitted. It wasn't my place to judge, and I regret it. Karoline studied her for a moment longer, then offered a small, tentative smile. We all make mistakes, she said. What matters is learning from them. The simplicity of her response caught Rachel off guard. She hadn't expected forgiveness, not so easily, but Karoline's words carried a quiet wisdom that resonated deeply. In that moment, Rachel understood that this wasn't just about her mistake. It was about growth, about recognizing where she'd gone wrong and choosing to do better. With a nod, Rachel returned the smile, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Thank you, she said sincerely. Have a good evening. As Rachel walked away, Karoline leaned back in her seat, exhaling softly. She hadn't expected the apology, but she was glad it had come. It didn't erase the initial sting of Rachel's comment, but it showed that people are capable of change, if they're willing to take responsibility for their actions, and sometimes that's enough. By the time the pilot announced their descent into New York, the atmosphere in first class felt lighter, almost peaceful. Passengers chatted amiably, sharing stories about their travels or plans for the upcoming week. Rachel moved through the cabin with a newfound warmth, engaging with everyone, including Karoline, with genuine attentiveness. The icy wall that had stood between them earlier had melted away, replaced by mutual respect and understanding. For both women, the flight had become more than just a journey from one city to another. It was a reminder that even in moments of misunderstanding, there's always room for connection, if we're brave enough to reach out and bridge the gap. As the plane descended toward New York, the cabin buzzed with the usual pre-landing activity. Passengers tucked away laptops, adjusted seatbelts, and peered out windows at the sprawling cityscape below. But for Karoline and Rachel, the energy between them had shifted in a way that felt almost palpable. The apology had been a turning point, not just for their interaction but for how they viewed each other. What started as tension and misunderstanding was now something softer, quieter, and far more meaningful. Rachel moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just ticking off tasks or following protocol anymore. She seemed genuinely present, taking the time to check on passengers individually. When she stopped by Karoline's seat again, it wasn't to deliver another awkward exchange. This time she smiled warmly and asked, "Is there anything else I can do for you before we land?" Her tone was friendly, without a trace of the earlier stiffness. Karoline looked up from her book, a novel she'd picked up during the layover, and returned the smile. "No, thank you," she replied. Then, after a pause, she added softly, "And thank you again. For apologizing, I mean." The sincerity in Karoline's voice caught Rachel off guard. It wasn't often that someone acknowledged an apology so openly, especially after being wronged. Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down and nodded. "You didn't have to say that," she admitted. "But I'm glad you did." Their brief conversation ended there, but the ripple effects lingered. Other passengers noticed the change too. Earlier, when Rachel had made her thoughtless comment, whispers had spread through the cabin like wildfire. Now, those same passengers watched as Rachel interacted with Karoline and everyone else with genuine warmth. It was subtle, but it mattered. People could tell when someone was making an effort, and Rachel's transformation didn't go unnoticed. For Karoline, the rest of the flight passed in a blur. She tried to focus on her book, flipping through pages about love and loss and second chances. Oddly enough, the themes resonated with her current situation. Life, she realized, was full of moments where people stumbled, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. What defined them wasn't the stumble itself, but how they chose to move forward. Rachel had chosen to own her mistake, and that act of accountability spoke volumes. When the wheels touched down on the runway, Applause rippled through the cabin, a common yet oddly comforting tradition among travelers. As the plane taxied to the gate, Rachel walked down the aisle one last time, thanking passengers for flying and wishing them safe travels ahead. When she reached Karoline's row, she paused, meeting her gaze once more. "Have a great trip," she said sincerely. "I hope everything goes well for you in New York." Karoline nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you. And take care of yourself." It was such a simple exchange, but it carried weight. Both women knew this would likely be the last time they ever crossed paths. Yet in those few minutes they had forged a connection neither expected, a shared understanding born out of conflict and resolution. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings and filing out of the plane. Karoline waited patiently, letting others go ahead of her. She didn't feel rushed. Instead, she took a moment to reflect on the journey. The flight had been far from ordinary, and while it hadn't started smoothly, it had ended with a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. People aren't perfect, and neither are their actions. But growth comes from acknowledging mistakes, and from choosing compassion over judgment. Stepping into the aisle, Karoline slung her bag over her shoulder and glanced back briefly at Rachel, who was busy helping another passenger retrieve an item from the overhead bin. Their eyes met for a split second, and Karoline gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. Rachel returned the gesture with a faint smile before turning back to her duties. Outside the plane, the terminal buzzed with activity. Travelers hurried past, dragging suitcases and chatting animatedly on phones. Karoline followed the crowd, weaving through families reuniting and business people rushing to catch connecting flights. Despite the chaos around her, she felt strangely grounded. The cross around her neck still rested against her chest, its cool metal a constant reminder of her values and of the grace she'd extended to Rachel. She found a quiet corner near the baggage claim and pulled out her phone. Opening her notes app, she typed a message to her grandmother, the woman who had given her the necklace years ago. "Hi, Grandma," she wrote. "Just wanted to let you know your gift means more to me than ever. Today reminded me why faith and kindness are so important. Love you." Hitting send, she slipped her phone back into her pocket and exhaled deeply. Writing those words felt cathartic, like closing a chapter she hadn't realized needed closure. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Rachel lingered for a moment after the last passenger disembarked. The cabin was eerily quiet now, the hum of engines, replaced by the soft rustle of cleaning staff preparing for the next flight. Leaning against the galley counter, she closed her eyes and replayed the day's events in her mind. She thought about her initial reaction to Karoline's cross, cringing at how judgmental she'd been. She also thought about the turbulence, the literal and figurative kind, and how it had forced her to confront her own biases. Rachel knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she could learn from it. That realization brought both relief and resolve. Over the next few days, she began researching workshops on cultural sensitivity and emotional intelligence. If she was going to continue working in customer service, she wanted to do better, not just for herself, but for the people she served every day. By the time Karoline stepped outside the airport, the crisp autumn air greeted her like an old friend. Yellow taxis lined the curb, honking impatiently as drivers jockeyed for position. She hailed one and climbed inside, giving the address of her hotel to the driver. As the cab merged into traffic, she leaned back against the seat, watching the city unfold before her. This trip was supposed to be about advancing her career, but it had become something more. It had taught her that even in moments of conflict, humanity has a way of shining through, if we let it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most valuable takeaway of all. The next morning, Karoline woke up early, the faint glow of sunrise streaming through the hotel room's curtains. She sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the city come alive below. Cars honked, delivery trucks rumbled down narrow streets, and people hurried along sidewalks bundled in coats against the crisp autumn air. It was a world full of motion, yet Karoline felt oddly still inside, as though she were carrying a quiet weight. a lesson learned that had settled deep within her. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts drifted back to the flight. The memory of Rachel's apology replayed in her mind, not because it lingered painfully but because it intrigued her. How often do people actually admit they're wrong? In a world where everyone seems so quick to defend their actions or deflect blame, Rachel's willingness to acknowledge her mistake stood out. Karoline realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of resentment. It was also about recognizing growth in others. She pulled out her laptop and opened the presentation slides she'd been working on during the flight. Scrolling through them, she paused at one slide titled Building Bridges. It was meant to discuss collaboration in professional settings, but suddenly, the phrase took on new meaning. Building bridges wasn't just about teamwork or networking. It was about connecting across differences, even when those differences seemed insurmountable. For the first time, Karoline saw her work and her life through a broader lens. Maybe this trip really would change things for her, not just professionally but personally too. Back at the airport, Rachel finished her shift feeling both drained and strangely lighter. She clocked out and headed to the staff lounge where she sank into a chair and let out a long breath. Her colleague, an older flight attendant who'd been with the airline for decades, glanced over at her. "You look like you've got something on your mind," he said casually, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Rachel hesitated before responding. Normally, she kept her thoughts to herself, preferring not to share personal struggles. But today felt different. "I think I messed up," she admitted, her voice low. "With a passenger earlier." Her colleague raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt, signaling for her to continue. So Rachel told him the story, how she'd reacted poorly to a young woman wearing a cross, how the comment had created tension, and how the turbulence had forced them into an unexpected moment of connection. She even mentioned the apology and how it had changed the dynamic between them. To her surprise, her colleague nodded thoughtfully instead of brushing it off. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is whether we learn from them. Sounds like you did." His words stayed with her long after their conversation ended. As she drove home, Rachel found herself reflecting on what he'd said. Mistakes weren't the end of the road. They were detours, opportunities to grow if you paid attention. She decided then and there that she wouldn't let this incident fade into the background. Instead, she'd use it as a catalyst for change. Over the next few days, Rachel began researching workshops and online courses focused on emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and conflict resolution. She signed up for a seminar scheduled later that month, determined to improve not only as a flight attendant but as a person. Every evening, she spent time reading articles and watching videos about empathy and communication. Some of the material challenged her deeply, forcing her to confront biases she hadn't fully acknowledged before. But instead of shying away, Rachel leaned into the discomfort knowing it was part of the process. One night, as she scrolled through testimonials from past attendees of the workshop, she came across a quote that struck her. "Empathy isn't about agreeing with someone, it's about understanding them." Those words resonated with her in a profound way. Understanding, that's what she'd failed to do with Karoline initially. She hadn't taken the time to see beyond the surface, to recognize that the cross wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of identity, faith, and belonging. From now on, she vowed to approach every interaction with curiosity rather than judgment. Meanwhile, Karoline dove headfirst into her business trip. Meetings went well, presentations flowed smoothly, and colleagues praised her insights. Yet despite her success, she couldn't shake the sense that something fundamental had shifted within her. During lunch breaks and late-night dinners alone, in her hotel room she journaled about the flight, unpacking her emotions layer by layer. Writing helped her process not just what had happened but why it mattered. She wrote about the initial sting of Rachel's comment, the way it had felt dismissive and alienating. She wrote about the turbulence, which had jolted them both physically and emotionally, creating space for connection. And she wrote about the apology, which had softened the edges of anger and replaced it with compassion. Through these reflections, Karoline came to understand that conflict, while uncomfortable, can be transformative. It forces us to confront our assumptions, question our reactions, and ultimately grow. By the end of the week, she found herself looking forward to returning home, not just to see loved ones, but to share what she'd learned. Life wasn't black and white, she realized. People weren't either villains or heroes, they were complex, flawed, and capable of change. That knowledge gave her hope, especially in moments when the world felt divided. On her last day in New York, Karoline visited a small bookstore tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Browsing the shelves, she stumbled upon a book about resilience and human connection. Flipping through its pages, she found a passage that made her pause. Every encounter is an opportunity to teach, to learn, to grow. Smiling softly, she purchased the book and tucked it into her carry-on bag, knowing it would remind her of everything she'd experienced during this trip. As she boarded her return flight, she noticed the flight attendant greeting passengers with warmth and professionalism. For a moment, she wondered if Rachel might be working this route again. But even when she realized it wasn't her, Karoline felt grateful for the reminder that people are more than their worst moments. They're capable of redemption, of reaching across divides and finding common ground. Rachel, too, was preparing for another flight as Karoline flew home. Standing in the galley, reviewing her checklist, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This job wasn't just about serving meals or ensuring safety. It was about making people feel seen, valued, and respected. She carried that mindset with her as she greeted each passenger, offering genuine smiles and attentive service. Though their paths never crossed again, both women carried the memory of that fateful flight with them. For Karoline, it became a story of resilience and grace. For Rachel, it served as a turning point, a moment that reshaped how she approached her work and her relationships. Neither of them could have predicted how much impact a single interaction would have, but perhaps that was the beauty of it. Sometimes the smallest moments leave the biggest impressions, reminding us of our shared humanity and the power of second chances. Weeks passed, and life moved forward for both Karoline and Rachel. The flight that had once seemed so pivotal began to fade into the background of their daily routines. Yet, its impact lingered in subtle ways, shaping how they navigated the world around them. For each woman, the lessons learned during those hours at 35,000 feet became a quiet compass, guiding their choices and interactions. Carolina returned to her regular life with a renewed sense of purpose. Her business trip had been a success. She'd secured the partnership she'd been working toward. But it was the personal growth she experienced that felt most significant. At work, she found herself approaching colleagues and clients differently. Instead of jumping to conclusions or reacting defensively when disagreements arose, she paused and asked questions. What's behind this perspective? How can I better understand where they're coming from? These small shifts transformed tense conversations into opportunities for connection. One afternoon, while catching up with her grandmother over video call, Karoline decided to share the story of the flight. She told her about the cross, the comment, and the eventual apology. Her grandmother listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little until Karoline finished. Then, with a knowing smile, she said, "You know, that necklace wasn't just a gift. It was a reminder to stay grounded, to lead with kindness, and to trust that even hard moments have meaning." Karoline nodded, realizing how true those words were. Wearing the cross hadn't shielded her from challenges, but it had reminded her of who she wanted to be in the face of adversity. Someone who chose understanding over anger, patience over frustration. That realization stayed with her long after the call ended. Rachel, too, noticed changes in herself. After attending the workshop on cultural sensitivity, she felt equipped with tools she hadn't known she needed. One exercise stood out in particular. A role-playing scenario where participants practiced responding to difficult situations without letting emotions take over. At first, Rachel struggled, falling back into old habits of defensiveness. But, as the session progressed, she began to see patterns in her behavior. She realized that many of her reactions stemmed from fear of judgment, fear of conflict, fear of not being enough. Understanding that gave her permission to let go of some of that weight. At work, Rachel applied what she'd learned. She started paying closer attention to passengers' body language, listening more intently to their requests, and offering help before problems escalated. On one flight, she noticed a young mother struggling to calm her crying baby. Instead of rushing past, Rachel knelt beside her and offered a reassuring smile. "It's okay," she said softly. "We've all been there." The simple gesture brought tears to the woman's eyes, not because the situation changed instantly, but because someone had acknowledged her struggle without judgment. That moment reminded Rachel of Karoline, the way she'd responded with grace instead of anger. It reinforced the idea that empathy wasn't just a skill, it was a choice. And every time Rachel chose empathy, she felt a little lighter, a little more connected to the people around her. Though their lives continued, separately, the ripple effects of their encounter spread wider than either could have imagined. Karoline shared her experience with friends and co-workers, inspiring others to reflect on their own biases and assumptions. Rachel, meanwhile, became known among her colleagues for her thoughtful approach to customer service. Passengers often praised her attentiveness in feedback forms, unaware of the journey she'd taken to get there. Months later, Karoline boarded another flight, not for business this time, but for vacation. As she settled into her seat, she glanced around the cabin, half expecting to see Rachel again. When the flight attendant approached to greet her, it wasn't Rachel, but the warmth in the attendant's smile reminded Karoline of their shared humanity. She smiled back, feeling grateful for the reminder that everyone carries their own stories, struggles, and triumphs. For Rachel, the memory of Karoline served as a touchstone whenever self-doubt crept in. There were still tough days, flights delayed by weather, passengers frustrated by circumstances beyond her control, but she handled them with a newfound resilience. She reminded herself that mistakes weren't failures unless you refused to learn from them. Each challenge became an opportunity to practice patience, to extend grace, and to grow. One evening, after a particularly long day, Rachel sat alone in the staff lounge, scrolling through photos on her phone. Among them was a screenshot of a quote she'd saved months earlier. "Kindness is the language which the deaf can hear and the blind can see." She stared at it for a moment, remembering the turbulence, the apology, and the quiet strength Karoline had shown. In that moment, she understood something profound. Kindness isn't just an action, it's a ripple. One act of compassion can spread farther than we ever realize, touching lives in ways we may never fully know. Years later, neither woman would forget the flight that had changed them both. For Karoline, it remained a testament to the power of forgiveness and the importance of staying true to oneself. For Rachel, it symbolized redemption and the courage to confront one's flaws. Their brief interaction had been fleeting, yet its impact endured, a reminder that even in moments of misunderstanding, there's always room for connection. In the end, the story of Karoline and Rachel wasn't just about a cross or an apology. It was about two strangers who, despite their differences, found common ground. It was about choosing empathy over judgment, growth over stagnation, and hope over resentment. And perhaps most importantly, it was proof that even in the vast expanse of the sky, human hearts are capable of bridging divides, one small act of kindness at a time.